Well, this is the right way to ask the question of what's happening is to take the long view. Uh, most of the world population lives in Asia, about 60%. Uh, for most of history, that means that roughly 60% of the world economy, world output, was produced in Asia, as best one can tell when historians look back and try to recreate economic estimates. In recent centuries, that changed decisively with the rise of Europe and of the North Atlantic, because in the 19th and 20th centuries, of course, the United States rose to become the largest economy in the world. Asia was eclipsed in this. Not only eclipsed, of course, it was dominated by European imperial powers. If you look around 1820 or so, Asia was still more than half of the world economy. But by 1950, after 150 years of the industrial age dominated by Europe and the United States, the whole Asian economy had declined to around 20% of world output from what had been roughly 60%. This meant China completely being eclipsed and, in fact, of course, attacked and losing many wars, first to the West in the First and Second Opium Wars, to chaos during the so-called Taiping Rebellion in the middle of the 19th century, to the extraterritorial privileges or rights or dominance of European powers in China at the end of the 19th century, and then to Japanese invasion in several episodes, starting with the Sino-Japanese War in 1894-95, and then several Japanese invasions, in fact, in the 20th century, and the massive invasions of the 1930s. Civil War in China in the 1940s. And this meant that by the time of the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949, China had gone through about 110 years of devastating defeats, what China calls the century of humiliation. China's share of the world economy uh, was is estimated to be maybe 2% of world output and roughly 20% of world population as of the 1950s. In other words, China was completely eclipsed from its long historical role in the world for at least a millennium, by the way, from 500 to 1500 AD, before the beginning of the European ascendancy. China clearly dominated the world across many technologies, uh, gunpowder, the steam engine, paper currency, the compass, large scale ocean navigation, and one could go on, in fact. So, the story, Glenn, that we see today, taken from a very, very long term perspective in history, is the return of China to the front ranks of power in the world and economic productivity and technology. In a sense, China has returned to its more traditional role in the world, which one could see for much of the last 2,000 years, in fact. The rise of China in this sense should be understood as a rebalancing of what was absolutely unbalanced, and that is a European dominated world. Of course, it's very hard for Europeans and Americans to understand that the idea of European dominance in the world has become an absolute natural standby. And that's been true for several hundred years, actually, where as Europe rose in power, as European empires dominated the other parts of the world, full ideologies, belief systems, rewriting of history, a lot of racism. One can add even by the leading thinkers of world history in the West came to say, well, Europe's dominance is natural. European cultural superiority, maybe racial superiority, uh, but whatever the argument was, European superiority is natural. Of course, now we're at the end of that phase of history. And one should understand it's not only the return of China, it's also the rapid development of India. It's the rapid development of Southeast Asia, the so-called ASEAN countries. It's the rapid development of parts of West Asia in the Gulf countries, for example. All of this is rather fundamentally ending the Eurocentric view of the world, or what in the late 19th century to the early 21st century became the North Atlantic NATO centered vision of the world. And by the end of the 20th century became the American centered vision of the world. And when you have these temporary imbalances of economy and power, as I said, you also put a bulwark under them, or I say you, I mean the tendency is that a bulwark is put under them in ideological or religious or some other philosophical sense to say that imbalance is natural. In the United States, the idea of American exceptionalism is very deep. The idea that, yes, of course, America rules the world is a deep part of the belief system, not a superficial item. So the rise of China is viewed with alarm. It's viewed with disdain. It's viewed with fear. It's not viewed with equanimity. I don't know any American leaders that say, well, of course, China's a big power that has had a long history of civilizational greatness, so it's natural that China's doing well. What you hear is China's the great threat to the world. China's rise must be stopped. We must contain China. We must prepare for war. China cheated and stole its way to economic recovery or return. It's artificial. China will collapse. In other words, many erroneous, superficial, biased, sometimes blatantly racist views to undergird this sense of superiority in the US that built up over 2 centuries. So I thank you for taking the long view, because that's typically what is precisely missing in understanding the big changes of relative economic and technological uh, performance in our world today. It's a natural catching up of those who fell far behind in the last 2 centuries for a variety of fascinating and complex reasons. But that imbalance that developed favoring the North Atlantic relative to the rest of the world has diminished and basically is coming to an end at this point.